Good evening. You're welcome to this month's LGBT History Club, which is a joint venture between the LGBT Heritage Project and the Lynn Hall Library. And tonight's speaker is Nadine Gilmore, who is completing a PhD at Queen's University Belfast on gay history. And the title of her talk is Belfast Pink Press, 1970s to 1990s. So over to you, Nadine.
Hi everyone, as Richard said, my name's Nadine and I'm a final year PhD student at Queen's, and my thesis looks at gay activism in Belfast in the 70s, 80s and 90s. I've previously researched the impact of the HIV and AIDS crisis in Northern Ireland, sexuality and migration, the emergence of gay politics in Belfast, the campaign for decriminalisation, a history of social activism using Cara Friend as a case study, and more recently I've been working on this research which is looking at Belfast's Pink Press. I'm also a volunteer with the Heritage Project, and I was involved with the Queer in the North exhibition which launched at the Museum of Free Derry at the beginning of last year. So I'm currently not an expert in queer media. This is something that I've only been researching for a couple of months, and many of you will be much bigger experts than I will be, because a lot of you will have been involved with the making of Belfast's Pink Press, whether that's as an editor or a writer or an illustrator or even a reader. So I just wanted to sort of see, out of curiosity, can people give me a wave if they've ever read or published or wrote to a gay magazine? There we go, about a third. You see, I'm just preaching to the choir, but hopefully you'll still find the talk interesting, and you know, for some of you it'll be educational and informative, and others it'll be a nice sort of walk down memory lane. Okay, so I'm going to go into the share screen option. It worked in the practice run, so hopefully it'll work again now. Let's see. Share screen. Which screen? Presentation. I have to talk to myself whenever I use computers, you see. I'm not too savvy. Presentation, share. Yes. Okay. Slideshow. From beginning. Okay, give me a thumbs up if you can see.
That's fine.
Oh, good. Okay. So Belfast Pink Press, 1970s to the 1990s. And my contact details are there if you want to take note, and you can ask me any questions later on. If we run over time, you can email me. So I don't want to get too academic sort of late on a Tuesday evening, but before I look specifically at the Pink Press in Northern Ireland, I want to do sort of a whistle stop tour of sort of a brief history of the Pink Press more generally. So there are a lot of different examples of Pink Press. It's something that comes from a really long tradition of gay publishing. One magazine called One Magazine was published between 1953 and 1972, and the Mattachine Review was published between 1955 and 1956. These were magazines that were really closely affiliated with the Mattachine Society, which was a homophile group established in the United States in 1950. And for those of you who don't know, homophile organisations were groups of gay activists that were quite conservative in their politics, and they were quite assimilationist and wanted to gain acceptance through education. Other examples include Arcady, which is a French magazine. It was published between 1954 and 1982. It's another example of a homophile publication. Films and Filming is a really interesting example. It's not exclusively gay or queer, but it was used by gay men in the period pre-decriminalisation for sort of sources of queer images. They printed a lot of quite homoerotic photographs, and I think that the contact pages were also used by a lot of people. Arena 3 was one of the first lesbian magazines published in Britain. Again, it was really kind of the homophile persuasion. It was quite conservative in outlook, and it really highlighted the sort of connection between psychology and homosexuality that was quite popular during the 60s. Well, the 50s and 60s, really. Then there's Gay Left, which was published by the Gay Left Collective. Jeffrey Weeks and Simon Watney, who are both very prominent queer historians, were actually involved in writing Gay Left. Then we have Gay News, which is probably the one that most people are familiar with. It was a nationwide newspaper that was published between 72 and 83, and it ceased publication in 83 following a lot of legal challenges. There was a legal challenge brought by Mary Whitehouse about blasphemy in their paper. And then Gay Times, which it's probably one of the longest lasting gay magazines probably in history. It started off in 1975 and it's still going. And I know I said I didn't want to be too academic, but in honor of that, I'm going to be slightly academic and recommend some further reading. So Martin Meeker's book, Contacts Desired, it's really, really good. It's all about lesbian and gay communications, and it sort of argues that publications in many ways were more instrumental in creating a gay identity than what gay activist groups were. It's actually quite inexpensive. You can buy that on Amazon for about £12. Justin Bengry, he does a lot of work on sort of the pink pound, and he looks at films and filming as a sort of an example of publications sort of courting the pink pound. And then you've got Rebecca Jennings' work. She looks at lesbian history in Britain, and she has written about the links between psychiatry and lesbianism in the 1950s and 60s, and she uses different magazines as a case study. And then I also want to talk about, if you want to do your own archive research on the pink press, Lennon Hall Library is a great place to start in better times because it's closed right now. But they have a really extensive collection of pink press. They have all the images of Gay Star, and they also have all the entire back catalogue of Gay News, which is absolutely enormous. But if you want to do some of your own research at the moment, there are a lot of really good digital archives. So Queerzine Archive Project is brilliant. It has a really, really diverse range of zines from across the world. They've got everything from, you know, grassroots publications from the 60s in America all the way up to really visceral queer magazines like Muff Monsters on Prozac. That's where I discovered that magazine. It was quite the find. Then there's Gay Left. You can access all of the magazines from Gay Left through that link. And the British Library have a collection of oral history interviews, and they are conducted with people who edited and established different gay magazines. But this talk is going to use two different case studies. I'm going to talk about the pink press specifically in Belfast and how it helped to contribute toward the formation of gay identity. And I want to start off with a little bit of the history of Gay Star. It was published between 1980 and 1991. There were 22 issues in total. It had originally started off as a quarterly. So the first couple of years, there are lots and lots of issues, but eventually it sort of became biannual and then annual. So it was just one publication a year, but it did run for 11 years. So it gives you a really good insight into the changes that happened in Belfast between the early 80s and the early 90s. The magazine started out as a successor to sort of Negro News and publications like that, sort of newsletters that kept people informed about the developments in the campaign for decriminalisation. It maintained a really close affiliation to the Gay Rights Association, but did have a fair bit of editorial independence from what I can tell. It's my suspicion that the magazine was dependent on the Northern Ireland Gay Rights Association's resources, because it gave people access to typewriters and printing and things that were actually needed for the logistics of creating their own publication. Articles were written by the editors, but submissions and letters from readers were also a huge part of the magazine's content. And these were occasionally referred to as reprisals, which I thought was funny. The magazine was primarily aimed at gay men. As you can see from this drawing, it's very sort of Tom of Finland. You've got a muscular gay man in what looks like a fireman's trousers, and he's got a very muscular back. Very nice. But there was some lesbian input as well that came in the form of poems and short stories, and there was some general interest articles and advertisements for lesbian events in Belfast that were run by Lesbian Line and Lavender Links. Gay Star was available to buy in the Students' Union shop in Queens and also at the University of Ulster up in their Coleraine campus. You could also buy it in Gardeners Newsagents on Botanic Avenue, at Just Books, which was an anarchist bookshop in Smithfield Market, and through independent shops like Compendium in London. And presumably it was available in London to cater for quite a big Northern Irish diaspora of gay men who lived in London in the 80s and 90s. So it was really a magazine for Belfast. It spoke a lot about gay identity in Belfast and actually probably contributed to the creation of a gay identity in Belfast by addressing some of the issues that are really specific to Northern Ireland, including the Troubles and religion and the impact that that had on the scene. And this photograph here, that's taken from one of the later issues of Gay Star. I think it's possibly even the last issue, the 1991 of Delaney's in Lombard Street, which I think is now, that's now Cafe Nero near Fresh Garbage. And you can see that they had a disco every Saturday night between 9 p.m. and 2 a.m. And you could get in free if you were there before 10. And they were running a competition. You could win a holiday to Amsterdam for 2. And they also had, in Gay Star, they had various sort of gossip columns about Delaney's and the things that people got up to there as well. But I decided not to include them to save anybody's embarrassment, just in the off chance that anybody might have been named in those. So yeah, the magazine talked a lot about the Troubles, and that's something that's quite neglected. There's always in other historical documents, there's always a sort of assumption that, yes, it was don't ask, don't tell, and absolutely nobody engaged with it. And there was absolutely no evidence of sectarianism within the gay community. But that's not to say that it wasn't discussed, and it was discussed within Gay Star. And you can see that in rumours that appeared in a 1982 issue. And the rumour was that came from the Bay Area Reporter, which was a gay magazine in San Francisco. And they wrote to Gay Star, and they said that they had received letters from people who described themselves as ex-Northern Irish gays, and stated that they had been kneecapped by the provisional IRA simply because they were gay. And that was something that was refuted by Gay Star. But of course, there always have been rumours that the provisional IRA and other paramilitary groups deliberately targeted gay people because we were thought to be sort of possible touts that were open to blackmail. So that I found that quite interesting. There's also articles about the Troops Out movement and London-based organisations that were supportive of the Troops Out movement, in line with sort of the anti-imperialist agenda. And there were articles in Gay Star that sort of refuted the viability of the Troops Out movement, and actually stated that they were very much in favour of the troops remaining in Northern Ireland because they believed that it protected them from a state that would be run by Ian Paisley, and would be completely based on moralism and would really undermine any advances in the gay rights movement. There were also accusations in the magazine about the character of some of the clubs in Belfast, particular accusations that the Carpenter Club was predominantly unionist. And the evidence for that was an incident in which people from a group called Gays Against Imperialism came to the club wearing badges that said Troops Out, and that they had the Irish flag on them. And because they were wearing these badges that were thought to be very inflammatory, they were denied entry to the club. And there were some people who felt that just because it was predominantly unionist didn't mean it was sectarian, and some people felt that it was sectarian. But I thought that that shed a really interesting light on the fact that actually some divisions did exist. They weren't always, it wasn't a 50-50 split within the gay community, but there were people who were unionist in outlook and nationalist in outlook, but it didn't necessarily mean that the community was divided. It just meant that that you could be both gay and nationalist and both gay and unionist. Religion was obviously something that was very prominent in Belfast. And it was also a prominent topic of conversation within Gay Star. A Dublin-based contributor reflected on his brief stay in Belfast, where he found that the only split evident amongst gays in Belfast is that between atheists and Christians. The Christians include broad Anglicans, Roman Catholics, and even fundamentalist Protestants, irreconcilable as that may seem. Given the deeply religious context of Northern Ireland, it isn't surprising that some of this religiosity could also be found within the gay community. In spite of the religious condemnation of homosexuality that had prevented law reform, many people were still members of churches. Bill, a man originally from Northern Ireland who'd spent a great time in Canada, actually shared his experiences of being a gay Christian within the magazine. Upon the advice of a psychiatrist, Bill sought out the local gay liberation group and found the organisation to be extremely anti-Christian. He recalled that people in the GLF insisted that it is impossible to be Christian and gay in any meaningful sense of either term, and that eventually they drove him out. Following Bill's leave of the GLF, he established the Gay Christian Fellowship, and that was the first gay Christian group in Belfast. And he did that with the aim of helping people, gay and otherwise, to work towards integrating their sexual and spiritual components into a whole person. There were also inclusion of articles that reference various interpretations of the Bible and the magazine actively promoted gay Christian groups. And that was really sort of pointed toward the intersectionality of the magazine, that it really wasn't, it didn't particularly side with the gay liberation views that Christianity and homosexuality didn't mix. It really spoke to the idea that you could have multiple identities and that none of them were at odds with one another. So throughout the 1980s, articles relating to biblical interpretation were commonplace and oftentimes critiqued fundamentalist interpretations of scripture, citing that Christianity is based ultimately on free will, and it is up to the individual readers of the Bible to make of that book what they will. Indeed, it became the official line of Gay Star. The actual evidence for anti-gay feeling in the Bible was quite flimsy. Gay Star's acceptance of homosexual Christians was such that a Catholic priest felt compelled to share his own acceptance of his religious sexual identity. He wrote, "It's not easy when you're gay. It's not easy when you're a priest. I'm a man who happens to be gay, who happens to be a priest, and this is the first time I've come out of my clerical closet to any extent. I believe it adds to my own vocation because I found among gays courage, great humanity, understanding, and real Christian faith. I have also found bitchiness, jealousy, anger, and the most awful discriminations." And again, that's evidence of some of the splits that were present in the gay community and how Gay Star tried to sort of create more unity between people. Atheists, gay men and lesbians were less outspoken in Gay Star. However, the magazine did continue to feature advertisements for events organised by the Belfast Humanist Group, including a talk entitled "Homosexuality, a Fact of Life." In spite of the friction between Christians and non-Christians within the wider gay community in Northern Ireland, it was felt that the Christian-atheist split is handled deftly and in the general context of solidarity. And there was also a lot of articles about sex in Belfast. You wouldn't believe the insight you get about gay sex in Belfast from Gay Star. It talked a lot about cottaging, and I've got a photograph here of one of the articles about cottaging, and it says, "Reports are filtering through of a suspected terrorist headquarters in Botanic Gardens in South Belfast. Large numbers of police and Land Rovers and unmarked cars have been staking out an innocuous guns and pistols are said to have been backed up by plainclothes detectives, some wearing white trousers. They return day after day to the scene of the suspected hideout of weapons dump. Of late, they appear to be accompanied by a teenage boy, and some of his former acquaintances, numbering half a dozen to date, have been brought in for questioning at Donegal Pass Barracks. And you can really see the sort of satire that the writers use in criticising the police for wasting their time staking out a cottage in Botanic Gardens whenever there are real threats in Belfast at the time. And but also how discrimination worked in Belfast, and how just because there was a civil war ongoing didn't mean that policing of gay men didn't still take place. So I thought that was very interesting. I think it's also really interesting that by including this article, it's sort of coded that yes, there are cottages in Belfast and you can go to them, but be careful because you might be under surveillance. There were also a lot of other articles about cottaging, which were quite interesting. There was a debate over a couple of different editions of the magazine, and some people defended the practice of cottaging, while others thought that it was a really dated practice and it shouldn't be legal. And I thought that those debates were really interesting because they sort of highlighted the way that people were started changing the way they thought about their own sex lives, and the extent to which the public-private domain should really work. And there was some quite funny material. Let me see if I can find it. Few seconds I've smothered myself in pages. I always tell myself I'll be very organized, and then it all goes a bit Pete Tone. Yes, so one of the people in his article wrote that I don't think it would be in our interest to demand that cottaging cease to be an offence under the law. And the reason that they didn't think that it should be legal was because it might promote anti-gay sentiment amongst the general community, which would be really detrimental to any sort of change in opinion that might have been ongoing as a result of the decriminalisation campaign. But other people were dead set against the idea of cottaging, mostly from a personal perspective, and wrote that they found it really indecent, and that he did not like the idea of going into the bathroom and hearing, I quote, sexual grunts and groans coming from a cubicle. And then he added that no one likes having an erect prick displayed in front of them when they go to a public lavatory, which I also thought was really funny. BDSM was also a really hot topic of debate in Gay Star. Some people felt that it was this, that you shouldn't engage in sexual practices which promoted the idea of submission, and that it was really anti-gay liberation to express yourself in this way and to engage in BDSM, while other people felt that that sort of moral policing of their private sex lives was really reminiscent of what had led homosexuality to be a criminal act in the first place. And there were also advertisements for a group called Buddies, which was a BDSM group in Belfast, and they advertised that they were really into leather. And I just found it really interesting that in such a small community, people were willing to actually put their really intimate tastes and personal habits out there and to make a group of it. And it really spoke to this really changing dynamic gay identity during the 1980s following decriminalisation, and how decriminalisation had given people the ability to be much more public in their sort of pursuits and hobbies. But Buddies obviously didn't do very well. A lot of people in Belfast didn't want to do that, so it sort of sunk after a little while. Contacts and personal adverts were also a really big part of Gay Star. Prior to 1982, I think there was only one example of a personal ad, and that came from someone who was 21 and from Brazil. And I think that the only reason they were able to publish that was because he was above the age of consent in terms of the law in England and Wales that said that yes, you could contact people and you could you could be in gay relationships if you were over 21, and also the fact that he was in Brazil, there was no risk of actual contact between the two, between a correspondent and the person looking for contacts. But later issues had really explicit contact adverts that also spoke about BDSM. And some, of course, were just looking for relationships, but Gay Star was able to really facilitate people finding one another and with similar interests. So one person placed an advert describing himself as a slim, passive guy, aged 48 with a hairy body. He then added that he requires regular sessions of bondage, complete restriction, and mild corporal punishment from guys or group genuinely interested in the same. So you can sort of see like the increase in explicit content within Gay Star, which is great fun. It's really nice to sort of see like there's such a watershed between the pre-1982 issues and then the post-1982 issues. And then gay art and Belfast poetry was an absolutely huge part of Gay Star. A lot of the magazines had special literary inserts, and they included poems from contributors in the editorial board, as well as short stories. And it was sort of interesting to see how a community and a dialogue began over these sort of very intimate accounts of people's experiences told through poems and short stories. And the way that some of the poems were used, I found to be really interesting, because sort of in lieu of a gay history that we have now, I mean, gay history sort of became quite popular in the 1990s, and we started to have many more publications about gay history. But in the 1970s and 1980s, they didn't have that. So we see actually historical works of literature and poems take the place of that to reaffirm gay identity. And one of the examples of that is a publication of Christopher Marlowe's poem, Hero and Leander. So Christopher Marlowe was he was a contemporary of Shakespeare, and he was rumoured to be gay. And the article was entitled Poems You Didn't Learn About in School. So the article gave a brief and suggestive synopsis of the poem, which detailed how Leander swims toward his lover, Hero, but on his journey there, he's intercepted by Neptune, god of the sea, and they have this very homoerotic experience. And then whenever they're finished, Leander reveals that actually he's not a woman, and that Neptune has just had sex with a man, and it's supposed to be very scandalous. There are also articles about Patrick Pearse and speculations about his sexuality, and his complete total lack of interest in women, which is very interesting. In response to Edward's suggestion that Pearse was only subconsciously homosexual, the author of the article declared that this was something which most of the readers of Gay Star, together with this author, must find difficult to imagine. And I think that's like a really tongue-in-cheek way of sort of insinuating that everybody who reads Gay Star is very out, because we know in Belfast in the 1980s, not everybody was out, and it was there was still a very hostile climate toward homosexuality. There were also a lot of poems from W.H. Auden and Wilfred Owen, and they were both really prominent poets in the early and mid 20th century. And again, you kind of see like older literary works being used to kind of assert gay identity and create a sense of history around identity. And then you have the short stories which are used, and they're really quite, some of them are particularly short, but there's an especially good story called Wrong Number, and it tells the story of someone who's just attended a job interview for the civil service, and he comes out of the interview and he knows that because he is very open about his sexuality, and that the interviewees probably knew that he was gay. He didn't get the job. And later that evening, he has a dinner party with his friend Gary, who's a policeman, and he ends up cracking a case for Gary, and ends up recovering a small fortune that has been hidden away by cracking this code. And then he gets a letter realizing that he telling him that he hasn't got the job in the civil service, which is particularly interesting because you can see the turn towards rights at work and gay activism through that story, and the very real discrimination people faced in getting jobs. And there was also, in terms of the sort of visual culture of the magazine, it started off as really quite sparse in terms of the images that were used in the magazine, and that's largely because I think due to the really small budget they had, they didn't have enough money to print elaborate photographs and they also had a really small editorial team, so there wasn't a wealth of illustrators around. But you start to see the magazine become a much more visual publication. And there are some examples of that, and this photograph is the most obvious. This is a photograph by Robert Mapplethorpe. He had recently died from HIV and AIDS, and it was a really big feature piece of his work, and his photographs are really explicit and feature a lot of naked people. And that's something that sort of, whenever the magazine was first published, would have been unthinkable to print, and would have actually resulted in probably the seizure of the magazine under sort of public indecency and indecency laws. So it became a really important arts publication in its later years, and was always very heavily rooted in literature, which was really helped to create a sense of community that was based on something other than sexuality, and also spoke to this sort of idea of like the respectable homosexual in a lot of ways, because the poems and the short stories and some of the earlier illustration, it was all very high art, it was all very middle class, and spoke to university educated audiences rather than sort of working class audiences. So you can see here as well how that contributed to a sense of gay identity, and a gay identity that was very much bound up with the identity expressed by the Northern Ireland Gay Rights Association that was very respectable. And the next magazine I want to talk about is my own personal favourite. It's Muff Monsters on Prozac, and it was published in 1996 and 1997, and I'm devastated that there are only 2 issues ever published. And it described itself as an independently produced potpourri of nonsense that will appear like a cold sore. And it really signified the emergence of a queer politics and a queer identity in Belfast that was the antithesis of what you would have seen in Gay Star. And it was a departure from much more moderate publications. And you can see here this photograph, My Beloved Was Queer Bashed here. This is taken from an article that details one of the contributors' trips to New York and with her girlfriend, and she sees this poster in the East Village in New York, and it really speaks to the emergence of a global queer identity in the 1990s. And we can see how that's starting to manifest itself in Belfast through publications like Muff Monsters on Prozac. It was really anti-capitalist, and that's something that you can see in this picture, which has a picture of Barbie in a little Barbie car, and it reads, "In the former USSR of the mid-1980s, it seemed that freedom equaled the opportunity to spend a week's wages on a Big Mac and fries, with multinational companies queuing up to advertise in glossy gay lifestyle mags. Are queers being sucked into the same consumerist crap? Like, are we supposed to be grateful or something that Guinness made an ad with a gay couple in it, but they wouldn't show it in case they got labelled as a fag drink?" And I think that that's really quite relevant to a lot of the conversations that we have today about gay pride and corporate sponsorship, and how large companies and brands capitalize on the pink pound, and without actually offering any real support or funding for groups that need it to do important outreach work. It was also a really anti-establishment magazine. It criticised the Northern Ireland government endlessly, and it was very critical of the DUP. It was feminist, which highlighted the sort of intersectionality of more queer politics, and it talked a lot about popular culture, which was very different to the sort of W.H. Auden and Wilfred Owen poems that you would have seen. This magazine really looks at The Simpsons and Xena and really big 1990s pop culture references that would have been open to a wider audience. But before I go on to the conclusion, I just want to do sort of like a little group reading of Monsters on Prozac. So I'm gonna stop share. And then I want to reshare. So share screen. Muff Monsters. See, I told you I have to talk to myself when I use a computer. There we go. Muff Monsters on Prozac. So this is the very first issue. And you'll recognize this picture from the promotion picture for tonight's event. And it's so well put together. It's little clippings that have all been photocopied, and the way it uses sort of black and white is really effective. You know, Gay Star was also black and white, but it's much less visually like shocking. It's very much more sort of almost, it's very safe looking in comparison to this magazine, which I just love. You've got your references to Bert and Ernie there. Can everybody see the magazine that I'm scrolling through okay? Yeah, good. And comic book strips. The comic book strips in this are just brilliant. They're so funny and humorous, and they really show off and critique like divisions within feminism and capitalism, and the illustrations are just great. The Chums, this one's one of my favourites. I really like the Chums. Hilda Hedgehog and her chums were on their way to the off licence after cashing their dole checks when they met Beatrice Burr. Poor Beatrice was looking rather sad. Why are you so glum? Worried Wanda. Sorry, I can't read it. It's really small. Worried Wanda Worm. I have a hot date with Frida Fox tonight, but I've lost my dental dam, sighed Beatrice. My girlfriend will be pissed off if I don't practice safe sex when I'm slutting about. Don't fret, Beatrice, perked Prudence Pig. We will help you to find your dental dam. What a super idea, hummed Hilda. And off they skipped to Beatrice's house for a grand search. They looked everywhere. They searched in the laundry basket, even in the cat's litter tray, but the dental dam was nowhere to be found. I'm getting hungry, moaned Prudence. Let's have some of my homemade lasagna, answered Beatrice. What the hell's this? The chums settled down for a well-earned feast. This lasagna is yummy, chomped Wanda. It's a bit rubbery, complained Hilda, finding the strange purple layer of pasta a bit tasteless. Crumbs, it's my dental dam, squealed Beatrice. That spliff I had before cooking last night must have been strong. Silly Beatrice, laughed Prudence, and they all chuckled merrily on the way to the pub for a celebratory pint. I think I probably read that comic strip about once a week just to cheer myself up because it makes me laugh. It's the sort of like post-AIDS safe sex content of it's really funny, and it's just a really, really brilliant brilliant strip. I just love it. What else have we got? There we go. We've got our Auntie McDonald's, our Auntie Guinness. Oh yeah, and we've got some good satire here. So today's weather, another severe weather warning today for Northern Ireland. And you can see that there's a strong winds of bigotry and moral tyranny coming in. And there's some other strong winds of depression. However, the depression will fade towards evening with gale force winds of subversion undermining the sneers of moral tyrants. And I've got my little queer ABC. Let's see, what have we got? D. D is for DUP, who tried to save Ulster from sodomy. They tried, oh how they tried, but those bad boys and girls shag on, which is why DUP members always look grumpy on TV. I think this could well have been published last week. P is for patriarchy, the overall male-oriented culture that has prevailed in most parts of the world for the past few thousand years. Its rigidity alienates both women and men from who they really are. I think it's about time to bid it adieu. And then here's a little guide as to how to behave at a mixed party. All men are potential rapists unless you're prepared to be considered a man-hating feminist lesbian bitch, which I am, on a good day. All women are lesbians. Any subversive truth, for example, see 1 and 2. Just a handy list of things not to say. Let them eat cake. Yes, unsung heroes, number 1, Lisa Simpson. And sort of like this brilliant feminist reading of Lisa Simpson. But I've given links, so if people want to go through those at their own time, I'm sort of conscious that we're getting on a bit. So stop share, and then share, presentation, share, conclusion, slide. Yeah, so publications produced by lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender people are important historical tools that help us to understand the peculiarities of everyday life, particularly in specific locales. I've learned more about gay Belfast looking at magazines over the past few months than what I have looking at organisational documents. Organisational documents tell us about organisations and the inner workings of different political groups, but they don't tell us about the everyday life of other people and what they like to read and what they enjoyed and what they did in their free time. Gay magazines chart the transformation of identity politics from that of respectable homophiles to the emergence of queer identity in the 1990s. So you can really see the changing characteristics of gay identity by looking at magazines. And finally, they showcase the talents of lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender people from around the world, and they help to reaffirm our identity, which is why I would encourage you to go and look at some magazines yourself. So yeah, I think that'll do me. If anybody has any questions or comments or memories or corrections, let me have them. I'll do my best to answer.
That was great, Nadine. Thank you very much. And I would say if you've got any questions, could you initially put them through the chat, and then we'll see from there. I'm also going to keep everyone muted for the moment because just Nadine, unmute yourself. Nadine, you can unmute yourself. Thank you very much, Nadine. I'd just like to say you wouldn't have heard the howls of laughter when you were showing the extracts from Muff Monsters because everyone was on mute, but I do believe that there was a 4 on the Richter scale recorded in Belfast due to the laughter that you didn't hear. Secondly, I would like to say before we go any further that there's more than one editor during this period of Gay Star, but the longest serving one would have been Sean McGoran. Sean McGoran was editor when I came to Belfast in '88, and he made such a contribution through this publication and other work, but given that there was so little material available to us, we were delighted to have a publication like Gay Star, even if it was, produced on a shoestring, and Sean did it as a voluntary activist. Sean isn't in great health. I did contact him hoping he'd be here to us tonight, but he wasn't able to join us. But I told him that it will be recorded and on YouTube, so he'll be able to watch it then and maybe able to communicate with you afterwards. Secondly, I'd like to say that I know that another person who I believe was an editor for a short time, Brian Gilmore, was able to join us. Do I know, Brian, you came in late, so you'd be welcome to say something if you want to. I'm also delighted to know that Ruth McCarthy is in the audience, and Ruth is the creator of Muff Monsters. And I've got great news for you, Nadine, because Ruth has put into the chat, you have only read 2 issues which you've devoured, but there is a 3rd issue which Ruth has not archived. So you can get in touch with Ruth about that. So happy reading.
I need more Muff Monsters and Prozac, so yes, please.
Now I'm going to have a quick look at the chat just to see what we have, and then I'm going to ask Ruth to say a few words since she's here. So Ruth, you can get ready for that. So Laura Aguiar, who's from our Prony guest, asks, was there anything in particular that surprised, amazed you when you were going through the magazines?
I mean, everything. There wasn't anything that really shocked me or that I didn't sort of already have an idea of. I think some of the poetry was, really brilliant. I didn't realize that sort of arts and literature had been so big, because I had been using organizational documents rather than anything else. So that was sort of quite surprising that there was such a huge poetry scene, and there was even poetry events that were held in 4 University Square, which is like the sort of gay hub in the 70s and I think early 80s. So that came as a bit of a surprise, and I think sort of I didn't anticipate the emergence of like queer identity as early as the mid-90s. And that sort of real intersectionality, because there's articles in Muff Monsters that are sort of about environmentalism and anti-capitalism, and some of the debates that we have now about big branding and gay pride. So I find that to be quite shocking. I just didn't expect that to manifest itself as early as the 1990s, because Belfast is traditionally quite far behind in terms of sort of what you might see in America. So I suppose that was probably one of the more surprising things.
Great, thanks. Ruth, are you there, and can you unmute yourself and maybe say a few words? Because I know you've posted that Muff Monsters was printed on the cover in the offices of an older lesbian woman who let us sneak in after hours and use the photocopier. So if you'd like to elaborate on that.
Can I just say, first of all, thank you for that. I mean, when we were making that, I was not expecting that it would ever happen, that someone would do a reading from it. That has tickled me so much and cheered me up of a wet Tuesday. So thank you for that, Nadine, so much. And I'm glad people enjoyed it, because I suppose the first thing to say about it, well, yeah, just to answer your question, it was Paula Keenan, actually. You can say it now because she doesn't work in that organization anymore, but Paula let us into her office. It was me. I mean, I had started the zine. My friend Fiona wrote some of the articles in it. You'll see that some of the writing is different. The second publication was done with my friend Terry, who's in the next room right now, who I still live with, gay man. And the third one was done by me on my own. And the most important thing to say about this and about all the publications is we made this because we were trying to communicate it. This is pre-internet, right? I was trying to find my people. I was a dyke, I was political, I was, into what was emerging then as, the word queer was being used for the first time in a way there in a political sense. I knew about the zine culture in London, about the emerging riot girl and queercore scenes, and nothing like that existed in Belfast. And I so desperately, it sounded like it was me, it was my music, it was my politics. And to me, this zine, I mean, and I think a lot of people who were making zines at the time, we saw it as a kind of it was a message in a bottle. for want of a better way of putting it. It was our message in a bottle to find our people, to find the girls who wanted to sleep with, who were interesting. I'm not even going to lie that that isn't the truth. That is the truth of it, right? That's the reason behind every rock band that starts. And that was the reason behind Muff Monsters on Prozac, right? And I like drawing cartoons. And the Chums is still one of my favorites. I don't know what I was on when I did that, but it was good crack. These things were essential because we didn't see ourselves anywhere. This is pre anything really been on telly, except for maybe late night Channel 4. There was certainly not a whole lot in Belfast. We were making our own culture because it didn't exist around us. And that is the key to the whole of zine culture, but it's also key to all of these magazines, from Gay Star to the Magician Society to everything. We were trying to get word out there. We were trying to communicate, and we were trying to, and certainly with Muff Monsters and Prozac, we were having a bit of crack because everything was so, like, every time queer people were on the telly or on the radio, it was in response to the DUP saying something shit about us, right? Let's face it. So this was us going, who are we? What are we about? Who are we trying to communicate? What are we about within ourselves? And that was one of the few spaces we have. So there was 3 issues of it. 2 are on the Queer Zine Archive project. One of them isn't. I will PDF it one of these days. It's a much longer one. And there's more cartoons in there, Nadine, so you'll be happy with that. The Chums didn't make a reappearance, but anyway, I don't want to take up much more space than that, just except to say we had a lot of fun doing it. And I have no doubt whatsoever that it was a precursor to what we do with Outburst now. This was my first foray into trying to do something different in Belfast and have a bit of crack, and also just trying to communicate that intersectionality when we were starting to realize when things post-AIDS became quite different. I'm very happy to talk to anybody about it anytime. As I said, I'm just tickled that something we made smoking fags all night, drinking stinking owl instant coffee till 4 o'clock in the morning, tickling ourselves pink, has any relevance to people now. So thank you for just including that, Nadine. It's really, really wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. Nadine, I'm going to move on with another question. It's from Tom Holmes, who asks, do you have a sense of what the circulation numbers of these publications were, and whether they were profit making or even break even, or just simply community oriented?
Well, I don't have a huge sense of that because I haven't done any oral history interviews with the editors, so I don't know what sort of the print levels were like, whether they printed a lot, whether they sold a lot. I think it was probably more widely read and more widely distributed than what I initially thought, especially with it actually being available to purchase in London. But I mean, I couldn't sort of even guess or hazard a guess at any specific numbers. In terms of whether or not it was sort of profit making, no, I don't think that it was profit making. I think that ideally it would have been, but there were constant sort of little footnotes, you know, we need subscribers, we need more funds, and it was, you know, quite, I did get the impression, especially when in the early days, that it was very financially stretched. But at one point I think that it must have been doing commercially quite well, because the format of the magazine really drastically changed. It went from being these A4 sheets of paper that were just stapled together to a double spread of like sort of proper magazine you could open up and flip the pages. So it was certainly money put into it at some point. And the price of it fluctuated a lot, and I suppose that's probably tells you a little bit about the supply and demand, but I don't have anything super concrete to say about that, unfortunately. So I don't know is the short answer.
Just to say about Muff Monsters, there was 200 of each copies printed until we ran out of ink. And Paula Keenan kicked us out of Ross and said, get the hell out of here or I'm in trouble. It was about 200 copies. They were distributed through mail only. We got lots of letters from people. I ended up having people from all over the world sleeping on my sofa because a copy of Muff Monsters and Prozac found its way to Australia or Chicago. Some of those people are still my friends to this day. But literally, they found a copy of the zine and they got in touch through the mailing list and said, we're passing through, and they would end up on my couch for a week. I mean, there are so many stories, and that's not just me, that's the whole zine scene. It was a community in itself. You know, so I would get letters from all over the world going, how the hell did you get a copy of this? And it was because somebody traveled somewhere and left a copy of it somewhere, and then it ended up somewhere else, and then ended up somewhere else. And there's a whole wonderful journey that those things go on. But 200 copies max, and I've got about 2 copies of each left. That's and the original drawings, and they're actually just sitting right over there in a box.
Thank you, Ruth. There's 2 questions here, and I might be able to actually add something to myself. One is from Amy, said, and a number of people said, thank you very much for a great presentation. But Amy is interested in the articles in Gay Star on religion, and who wrote the articles on inclusive religion, were some of these clergy or lay people, and they were, and pseudonyms were used. But I should also point out that because the queer community was so small, that made it more possible for there being personal relationships and friendships between people who might have very different political views, for example, atheists and people of faith. So whereas you might have not found that possible in a much larger city, I think those personal friendships made it easier. For example, an editor who was not necessarily a person of faith being able to accommodate a gay Christian contribution into the magazine. Secondly, coming down, Jeff Dudgeon reminds us, he says, are we on Nigra News? The editor was Brian Gilmore, who I saw coming in. Then Northern Gay editor was Sean McGoran, then Gay Star. And I should also add that there were a few kind of intermittent newsletters, which basically were from the same stable, but were of shorter number of pages. But like Upstart is one that was quite common in the late 80s. And I can add for Tom Hume that like these came across as a labor of love. I mean, it was very much for the community, and certainly in the early years, the idea of someone making a profit. But I never remember paying for Gay Star. So I think it was just available at, for example, the drop in at say cathedral buildings or at Queen's. There's some questions about the content. So there's quite a few questions here. I'm just trying to flick through. Orla Egan from the Digital Archive in Cork has mentioned that they have a few items would also pertain to this period of history. I'm just going to see, is there anyone who wants to ask an oral question? And I'll switch to gallery view so I might be able to see you as an alternative. Okay, so if anyone wants to ask Brian Gilmore there, would you like to say a word? If you want, you're unmuted.
Yeah, well, I enjoyed the last half of the talk. It was absolutely brilliant. Thank Nadine and all her sources. That's really it. Do you hear that?
Yes, yeah, and thank you, Brian, for the time you put. I know that at one time you were an editor, and you one of those ones who accommodated progressive material from a faith perspective, and which maybe not every editor in every situation would have been happy to do, and that had a very valuable role, I think, in Northern Ireland to have that sort of contribution, challenging Christian homophobia from a faith perspective. Is there anyone else who has a question, who wants to, if you either put on the raise your hand yellow, or you can unmute yourself and speak out if you want to. You needn't just unmute yourself if you want to speak up.
Nadine, that was great. That was really interesting. Thank you very much. And Ruth, it was great having you here. I could see you grinning when she was reading that stuff out. And clearly there's like so much amazing material there that can be added to the Northern Irish LGBT archive that you're creating, which is brilliant. The question I had was around whether, Nadine, you found anything about the Cooperation North exchanges between Belfast and Cork that were in the late 1980s, if there was anything in Gay Star. I know you said it was kind of primarily focusing on gay men, so I'm just wondering if there was anything about the exchanges between the Women's News in Belfast and the Women's Place in Cork, and then the national kind of lesbian line network, both of which that were funded by Cooperation North.
There actually isn't really anything at all mentioned about that in Gay Star, and I think probably one of the reasons for that is that by the late 1980s, the magazine had changed quite a lot. It wasn't as political in its outlook, and it had become much more arts based. It was really more about sort of poetry and film reviews and book reviews and literature reviews and reviews of plays, and about really sort of creating more of a sense of community around the arts in Gay Star anyway. But Women's News had much more of that material. I think it's sort of, you do still see quite a big separation between lesbian publications and gay publications in the late 1980s. It just doesn't touch on what lesbian groups were up to. It's not widely published in that at all, but Women's News does look at it. Women's News was very intersectional between feminism and lesbian rights movement. So it looked much more at Cooperation North. Muff Monsters, I don't think sort of looks at it because it doesn't look at any sort of official campaigning. It's a very different publication in that it's really all about queer identity rather than sort of the big political organisations in Northern Ireland who were really well established. It was much more grassroots.
Thank you, Nadine. I'm going to stop the recording in the next minute, but we will continue talking. And before I do, I'll take advantage of the fact that this recording will be going up on the YouTube channel of the Lindenhall Library. So I'd like to thank Nadine for a really interesting presentation, and I think that a lot of people will be just surprised that they didn't think that this material was out there, and we hope to have some of it, as I said, digitized for our LGBT Heritage Project digital archive. So thank you very much for raising awareness about this particular topic, and I think people can't restrain themselves from actually giving you a show of applause before we end the recording. Now we will continue to chat for a few more minutes, but I'm going to take this opportunity to say our next month's talk is LGBT History Month is next month, February, and we're going to have a number of events, and they will be advertised on the social media of the LGBT Heritage Project, which is at LGBT History NI. But the February talk for our club will be on Tuesday, the 23rd of February. Tuesday, the 23rd of February at 8 p.m. on Zoom. And it's a talk by Hilary McCollum. And Hilary is doing a PhD at Queen's University. And the title of her talk is Reclaiming the LGBT Past Through Fiction. So that's Hilary McCollum on Tuesday 23rd, and I'll put that up on a Facebook event. So I'm going to knock off the recording now more.